All right. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the C. Bailey Hub Podcast Network. I just want to take a brief second to thank everybody who tuned in to the last Star Wars episode, who has helped to make that a success. It really means a lot to me. And today we're going to be staying in the world of film, slightly switching gears, and we are going to be talking about comedy. Now, with the writer's strike just ending in Hollywood, and after having a few conversations with friends, I've kind of come to realize that the world of comedy movies and comedy film in general is really at an all-time low. I can't tell you the last time, well, I can't tell you the last time I went to the theater, but I can't tell you the last time I really watched a new comedy film that really stood out to me. I feel like it's there, um, writers and even comedic actors that are really in a rut. So today we're going to be going back in time to an era of comedy that I consider to be legendary, iconic, an era, excuse me, of comedy that I grew up with, and that is comedies from the 1980s. My dad played a heavy hand in influencing um, some of the movies that will stick with me the rest of my life. Movies that I quote to this day, movies with an iconic core of actors that we're going to see in just a second that really made the 80s a wonderful decade for comedy films, amongst other things. Those who know me know I'm a big fan of the 80s, but some of these movies are just all time greats and ones that I love. So we are going to today be looking at some of those actors. We're going to be tracing their roots and seeing how they shaped a decade that, like I said, I consider to be all time. So let's start with those guys. Let's start with the players. Now these guys are form the core of what I consider to be the essential comedy films of the 80s. You've got Bill Murray, Dan Aykroyd, John Belushi, John Candy, Eddie Murphy, Chevy Chase, and Steve Martin. And obviously, there's a lot of overlap there. They starred in each other's films, they collaborated, worked together, not only in movies, but beforehand in television sketch shows like SNL and Second City Comedy, which we're going to see in just a second. Because when I was doing my research, I found that all of these comedic actors came out of two main camps. And it's really interesting just how influential those two camps would go on to become in the world of film. And so the roots of really almost all of the great 80s comedy films come out of two different comedy sketch shows. They come from Saturday Night Live and Second City Television. Now, Saturday Night Live started in 1975, created by Lorne Michaels. It is obviously still running today. I don't think the quality is nearly as good, but obviously it has stood the test of time. And some of the great actors who came out of Saturday Night Live are Chevy Chase, famous for his weekend update. That's something they still do on the show today, but he was really the first to make that an iconic bit and part of Saturday Night Live. John Belushi, uh, who had several famous and hilarious bits on there. The samurai bit is one of my favorite. Uh, his Joe Cocker impersonation, singing with a little help from my friends when he's flailing and screaming and rolling all over the stage. Just hilarious. Dan Aykroyd, his Wild and Crazy Guys with Steve Martin, as well as Fred Garvin, male prostitute. You had Bill Murray doing Nick the Lounge Singer in The Nerds. He also took a turn at Weekend Update. And his brother, Brian Doyle Murray, who did some acting, kind of took more bit roles in films that Bill was in, but also did some things on his own, but also had an important role as a writer behind the scenes as well. You had Steve Martin. Now, Steve was never an official part of the SNL cast, but he did host it. Steve got his roots really in stand up comedy, and was very successful, still successful in that. as a matter of fact. And but he did host plenty of times. He's taken his turn at that quite a few times. And some of his more famous skits, Wild and Crazy Guys, like I mentioned before, he did the King Tut, which is really great. And then you have Eddie Murphy, who's one of my favorites. Also got his start in stand up, an iconic stand up comedian. But some of his more notable skits, he had James Brown in a Hot Tub, Gumby, Mr. Robinson's Neighborhood, and all of those guys who I just mentioned went on to do major things in the film world after. And then on the other side, you had Second City Television, which started a year after in 1976, ran to 1984. It has its roots in Canada. So a lot of these guys that you see come out of there are Canadian actors and comedians. And the most notable for me being John Candy, who got his start on that show playing characters like Johnny LaRue and Dr. Tongue. You also had Eugene Levy. The two of them would collaborate at various times over the years. I'm thinking Armed and Dangerous. But Eugene Levy was known for his impersonations on the Second City television program. Rick Moranis, who played Bob McKenzie, who was a kind of a Canadian hockey commentator, I guess you could say, on the show the Great White North was their sketch. Catherine O'Hara, who more recently starred in Schitt's Creek with Eugene Levy. I know that show was a big hit. Martin Short, who collaborated with several of these guys. I always think of him as Frank in Father of the Bride with Steve Martin. But obviously the name of the show is Escape Only Murders Left in the Building. They recently collaborated on, and then Harold Ramis, who did spend some time on screen, but until I did more research, really spent more time behind the scenes as a writer. Several of these movies that I'm going to talk about in just a few minutes, Harold either had a hand in writing or directing. I didn't realize that until like I said, did a little more research. Obviously, he stars in Ghostbusters and Stripes, but just as much as you see him on screen, he had really more to do behind the scenes. And so, what I'm going to do in just a second here, I've assembled a list of my top 10 favorite 80s comedies. But before I do that, I did want to just quickly shout out, do some honorable mentions, because when I was putting this list together, I talked to some friends and, we were going through the movies and I probably had it down to like 12 to 15 films. And that would have just taken a really long time. So these are some of the movies that I came up with as honorable mentions. Fast Times at Ridgemont High, Sean Penn, iconic as Jeff Spicoli in that. That movie I saw when I was in high school. I consider that to be kind of not a precursor, but one of the original and iconic I guess you could call it teen comedies, go on to inspire movies like American Pie. You've had the Brat Pack starring in films like Breakfast Club and 16 Candles. Breakfast Club, a few people mentioned, and I consider it to be an iconic 80s film, but not really a pure comedy. There are definitely some more serious themes in there. But that cast, Anthony Michael Hall, Emilio Estevez, Molly Ringwald, definitely went on to kind of carve out their own corner in the 80s teen comedy, dramedy kind of world. And those are movies that I love. 16 Candles is a lot of fun. The Goonies, an action adventure. I still do the truffle shuffle. I still, I'm a teacher now. I expose my students to just goofy, funny scenes from that. When we talk about in science, we talk about the Rube Goldberg machine and that kind of contraption they have to let people in and out of the property. That's really funny and just a great movie. A lot of fun for everyone. And Steven Spielberg directed that one as well. And then we have in the top corner, you've got Ferris Bueller's Day Off, written and directed by John Hughes. And we're going to hear that name quite a bit when I get to, I think, at least three or four of the movies on my list. John Hughes had a hand in writing a lot of iconic 80s comedies, more than I think you would even know. Um, and he also, and I forgot to mention this a minute ago when we're tracing the roots of these films, he also wrote for the Lampoon magazine, which was created by Doug Kenny and Henry Beard at Harvard. It was a comedy writing club, I guess you could call it. I know they did a parody of Lord of the Rings. I think it was called Board of the Rings, something like that. And they went on to start the Lampoon magazine, which discovered they had a hand in discovering a lot of young talents like Chevy Chase, like Bill Murray. And Doug Kenny certainly had a hand in writing movies like Caddyshack. So I didn't want to leave those guys out when I was talking about the roots of some of these movies I'm going to talk about in just a second. All right. So that leads me to my tier list. Now, in the past, when I've done these rankings, they've definitely been a little more serious than what I'm going to do today. You can see the tiers. I tried to create them based on 80s adjectives, I guess you could say. So my top tier is totally rad, righteous, and then we got gnarly. Now, all of these films are special to me. I really love all of them. And this really isn't like one is above another in a real serious way. This is just a lot of fun for me. It was a lot of fun for me to go back and research, and just I was watching clips as I was pulling this together, and just so many iconic quotes, so many iconic scenes, so many iconic characters. I don't think there will ever be a stretch of movies like this. Even certain years, like the year 1980, we're going to see produced so many iconic comedies. And it really was just a special time. And they kind of the actors who worked in this time, I really think influenced decades to come, because they, like I said, they starred in each other's films. They all worked together, and you saw that in the years that would follow. I especially think of guys like Vince Vaughn and Owen Wilson and Luke Wilson and Will Ferrell. That group really came together and made a whole run and stretch of iconic comedies in the 2000s, which I think I don't know if they quite rival these movies for me, but I consider that to be a pretty strong time for comedy as well. But anyway, that aside, let's get started with my top 10 80s comedies. Here we go. Starting off with the Blues Brothers. Now, the Blues Brothers came out in 1980. It was written by Dan Aykroyd and John Landis, and it stars John Belushi and Dan Aykroyd as Jake and Elwood Blues. The movie begins with them being released from prison, and they go home. They go, I guess you could call it home, to the orphanage that they were raised in, to find out that the orphanage is being closed down. And they go on a mission from God to get the band back together and save the orphanage. And all along the way, they encounter several famous musicians. This movie is really cool for me because it's got the foundation of a classic buddy comedy. The Blues Brothers actually started as a skit on SNL, so it's got that foundation. But there's elements of action. There's certainly musical elements. There's tons of musical numbers in there. You see along the way, you see James Brown, Cab Calloway kind of plays their mentor. Got Aretha Franklin, who's the kind of jilted lover of the guitar player in the band. Ray Charles, Shaka Khan, John Lee Hooker. You've got a young Carrie Fisher making an appearance, trying to blow them up. Um, and I think this movie also set records in terms of budget. The car chase at the end, the amount of cop cars that they ruined, I think set an all-time record. And to me, this movie just combines so many great elements. the music's awesome. You know, Dan Aykroyd and John Belushi, they weren't just acting in this. They loved blues music and they put out a record. I wish I had it with me. I couldn't find it when I was trying to I got my albums in the back. You can see Back to the Future and Huey Lewis and the News Sports. I couldn't find my Blues Brothers record. But they actually lived it. They played it. They you know, and to me this movie's just a lot of fun. And you do get a brief appearance by John Candy in this one as well. You get it and to me, you know, Blues Brothers it's a righteous film. It's not I'm not going to put it up in the totally rad category just because it's not one that I really go back to and rewatch a ton, but the times when I do catch it or I do sit down and watch it, it's always just a ton of fun for me. Um all right. So, next up, we have Beverly Hills Cop. Now, I used to, and I might still consider this to be my favorite 80s comedy. It's really hard. The more I research this, the more I realize just how much I love all these movies. And this is a movie that's actually kind of come to me a little bit later in my life, but it's one I love. It's one that's a lot of fun. So this movie came out in 1984. The screenplay was by Daniel Petrie Jr., directed by Martin Brest. It stars Eddie Murphy as Axel Foley. You've got Judge Reinhold as Billy Rosewood, John Ashton as Sergeant Taggart. Just the interaction between those three guys, the banana and the tailpipe, Eddie Murphy just kind of messing with them, and then them all coming together. You've got Ronnie Cox as Lieutenant Bogomil, Stephen Burkoff as Victor Maitland, who's the villain in the story. And you know, it starts off with you know, Eddie Murphy being reunited with his buddy Mikey, who spent time out in Beverly Hills and then is murdered, and so Axel takes up and heads out to Beverly Hills, and I think Eddie Murphy was really the perfect person to play Axel. I remember seeing an interview with, I can't remember who it was. I don't know if it was one of the writers or, but they said that Sylvester Stallone was originally rumored to um, have gotten selected for the role, and it would have been a totally different movie. Um, Not only is Eddie Murphy hilarious in this, he's cool. He's tough when he needs to be tough. Obviously, you know, he's got a lightness about him the whole time that even though he's investigating this very serious thing, he never seems to take anything too serious, and he just that kind of allows him to just go with the flow and you know, the to me the it's the perfect 80s movie. You know, the iconic synth soundtrack, you know, the theme, the Axel F theme, the dun 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 dun. That's perfect 80s. I mean, that's so 80s. You've got The Heat Is On also by Glenn Frey. I love this movie. It's a lot of fun. The sequels actually are, in terms of some movies that do comedy movies, especially that have sequels. Beverly Hills Cop 2 isn't entirely terrible. But for me, this one is it's totally rad. I love Beverly Hills Cop. All right. Next up, we have Caddyshack. So Caddyshack also came out in 1980. So 1980, big year for comedy. It was written, and I didn't know this until I did some research, written by Brian Doyle Murray, Harold Ramis, and Doug Kenny of the Lampoon. It was directed by Harold Ramis, who we don't actually even see in the movie. And it stars Chevy Chase as Ty Webb, Rodney Dangerfield as Al Cervic, Bill Murray as the wacky Carl Spackler, the groundskeeper, Ted Knight as Judge Schmales, and Michael O'Keefe as Danny Noonan, the caddy for Ty Webb. This movie is hilarious. I just think Chevy Chase kind of plays the aloof Ty Webb, the guy who is clearly successful but doesn't care at all about it. Is kind of just skating his way, and just kind of there in that whole country club, uh, I guess, scene, having a good time, but never taking life too seriously. You've got Ted Knight as Judge Schmales, who's just uptight and the perfect rich a-hole, and then Rodney Dangerfield, the guy who's come from nothing to be successful in business and just ruin everything Judge Schmales is about, from his his golf bag to. I love the scene when Judge Schmales is christening his boat, and Rodney Dangerfield comes flying in and just ruins the day for him. So iconic. Chevy Chase with his, be the ball. I can't think of, tell you how many times I've said that on the golf course, and, the shana na 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 na. And then Bill Murray, who I think did all of his filming in like a week. He was barely on the set. And it's rumored that Chevy Chase and Bill Murray didn't like each other very much, but his whole Cinderella story monologue, his war with the gopher, for me, Caddyshack is it's a righteous film. I can't quite get it up in the totally rad category, but it's one I'll definitely rewatch, and it's a lot of fun, and really one of a kind. You don't get a lot of golf movies. There are some, but you definitely don't get a lot of golf comedies, if any. So it's unique and just a lot of fun. All right. Next up, we have one of my favorites. This one I can already tell you is going to be up in the totally rad category. And that is National Lampoon's Vacation, the original, the one that started it all. Now, there have been sequels, one of which I'm going to talk about next. The others aren't really worth mentioning, I don't feel. But this is the original, came out in 1983. Screenplay by John Hughes. Like I said, we're going to hear from John Hughes. Also directed again, Harold Ramis, coming through again. It stars Chevy Chase as America's favorite dad in the 80s, Clark Griswold. Beverly D'Angelo as Ellen Griswold. Randy Quaid as the hilarious and I guess you could say down on his luck cousin Eddie. Anthony Michael Hall, a very young Anthony Michael Hall, is Rusty. Dana Barron, who plays Audrey, and I feel like she does the best portrayal of Audrey. One of my biggest qualms with these films is that the kids are different actors in each movies, and I feel like she did the best Audrey, and Anthony Michael Hall also did the best Rusty. And then you've got Imogen Coca as Aunt Edna, who they pick up along the way and have to bring her to Phoenix, and along with her dog, who neither end up making the journey. You've got Eddie Bracken as Roy Wally, and then Eugene Levy, John Candy, Christy Brinkley as the girl in the Ferrari, and a young Jane Krakowski plays cousin Vicky, who went on to be more famous for her role in 30 Rock. But I remember I got this movie, I think, in middle school. I think my Uncle Byron got me it for Christmas. And I just love this film. Chevy Chase he plays such a goofball, kind of a almost loser of a character as Clark, but he just wants to, his intentions really are pure. He just wants to, show his family a good time and kind of share some of the experiences he had growing up of, going on a road trip with his family, going on vacation with his family. And obviously they're trying to get to Wally World, and there are times where you really don't feel like they're going to make it. For me, my favorite scene in this movie is when they stop at a rest stop, and they're having a picnic, and Clark is kind of off to the side with his sandwich, and Christy Brinkley rolls up in her Ferrari, and that da 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 da, you get that iconic synth line going in the background, and Clark's got his sandwich, and he's dancing around, and blowing kisses at Christy Brinkley, and then he starts eating his sandwich, and I don't remember who. I think it's I think Ellen yells out that the dog peed in the picnic basket, and it's just that to the ending, kind of the climax when they finally reach Wally World, finding out it's closed, getting the message from Marty Moose, and Clark just losing his mind, punching Marty Moose in the nose, going to the sporting goods store, holding up John Candy, the security guard, and making him, take his family on the rides with the BB gun, and and the SWAT team coming in and meeting Roy Wally. To me, it's an all time great film. Um, and obviously, you do get other, like I said, these guys they kind of just pop in and out of each other's movies. Early on in the film, you get Eugene Levy as the car salesman, who Clark thinking he's going to be getting a sports car, ends up with the family truckster wagon, which is nearly destroyed by the end of the film. To me, this is a totally rad movie. I love it. I can rewatch it over and over again. It's a lot of fun. All right. Now, next up, we're going to stay with Lampoons here, and talk Christmas Vacation, which I think is, like I said, there are a few other of these films. This one is iconic. We've obviously got the holiday season coming up. This is a movie I know my brother loves a lot. I like it too. I think him and I would probably differ on this a little bit. He would probably hold Christmas a little higher than the original, and we would kind of go back and forth on that. But um, so Christmas Vacation came out a little bit later on in 1989. Also written by John Hughes. Now, this was based on a short story called Christmas 59 that was actually written and published in the Lampoon magazine by him. So he had that, again, connection to those guys, Doug Kenny and Henry Beard. Directed by Jeremiah Chechik. Um, Also starring Chevy Chase, Beverly D'Angelo. This time you have Juliette Lewis taking her turn at playing Audrey, and Johnny Galecki, of Big Bang Theory fame, playing Rusty. John Randolph playing Clark Sr., Doris Robert playing Frances, who I think is most famous for her role in Everybody Loves Raymond. Randy Quaid's back as Cousin Eddie. And when I think of this movie, I the first thing that comes to mind every time is that scene where Clark wakes up. He's got his Blackhawks jersey. He goes down and he's looking out the window and he's talking to his wife. And Cousin Eddie's out there and he's unloading his he's unloading his toilet into Clark's sewer. And I'm not going to repeat the language. Um, but that's obvious. He's out there in his bathrobe with the stupid hat on and waving, and and obviously Cousin Eddie plays a pretty pivotal part in that movie. He kidnaps Clark's boss after Clark is upset, but after not getting a raise, and only receiving a Jelly of the Month Club subscription for Christmas. Um, Clark's scene on the saucer, um, and then I think of Aunt Bethany, the wacky aunt who comes to dinner, and they say grace, and the turkey explodes, and it's to me it's a lot of fun. I don't really consider this movie to be as good as the original. I think that it's a smaller movie, I guess, and definitely in terms of scale, and there's not as much adventure. Obviously, in the original, you're taking a essentially a cross country trip. This one's kind of contained to the home, but you still have, Clark still his heart is still in the same place. He's still trying to, instead of a vacation this time, he's trying to give his family a classic Christmas. To me, I'm going to put it on the gnarly tier. It's I love, again, you can't go wrong with any of these movies. This is just kind of my preference. Um, but I'm sure I'll watch it. I hope I get to watch it at some point during the Christmas season. All right. So next up we have Ghostbusters. This is This one's going up in the totally rad. I can already tell you that for so many reasons. I remember I saw this again. This was a movie I probably saw in middle school. And I was actually just today talking to a buddy about it, and he's like, "Yeah, you told me about some of the movies you're going to be doing, and when you mentioned Ghostbusters, I didn't really think of it as a comedy." He said the movie kind of used to scare me a little bit, and I was like, "Yeah, it kind of scared me a little bit too, but it does have some of those horror type elements to it." Some of the monsters, you've got some supernatural spooky things going on in the movie, and there were scenes that kind of did scare me a bit as a kid, but I also just had it's just so much fun. And just to get the particulars out of the way, this came out in 1984. It was written by Dan Aykroyd and Harold Ramis, directed by Ivan Reitman, who also directed other movies on this list. It stars Bill Murray as Peter Venkman, Dan Aykroyd as Ray Stantz, Sigourney Weaver, I'm sorry, is Dana Barrett, Harold Ramis is Egon, Rick Moranis takes his turn as Lewis, the neighbor down the hall. Annie Potts plays the secretary Janine. William Atherton plays a bit of an antagonist. Walter Peck, who's trying to, I believe he works for the EPA and he's trying to shut them down. You've got Ernie Hudson, who plays the final addition to the Ghostbusters, and Winston. This movie is, and I mentioned the soundtrack in Beverly Hills Cop, the Ghostbusters theme by Ray Parker Jr., even though he ripped off my man Huey in the background here and was famously sued for it. Just, when I think of Halloween, I think of that song, and I can't really go through the Halloween season without watching this movie. And I think the most iconic scene and my favorite scene is when they get called into to the hotel, and they're chasing the green ghost through the hallways, and come in, Ray. He's looking at me, Ray. I think he can hear you. That whole, and then he slimes Peter, and then they chase him into the ballroom, and Peter rips the tablecloth, and the flowers are still standing, and don't cross the streams, and just so much fun. And the climax of the movie with the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man, and confronting what was it, Gozer at the end. Just a ton of fun, and inspired my brother and I probably our best and most memorable Halloween costumes. I remember never being so proud as I was that Halloween to get to put on my coveralls and my homemade backpack and go out. And I love this movie, man. They don't make movies like this anymore. I know that they did that Ghostbusters Afterlife with Paul Rudd and kid Finn Wolfhard from Stranger Things, and I think they're actually, I don't know if it's in the works right now, going to do I guess I don't know if it's a remake or um, with the original guys, but for me, you're never going to make another movie like this. The sequel was the sequel wasn't really good, but this one totally rad, all time, one of the greatest movies ever. All right. All right, and now we're going to stick with my man Bill Murray here on the next film, as well as Harold Ramis. And we're going to talk about Stripes. Now, Stripes came out in 1981. It was written by Len Bloom, Dan Goldberg, and Harold Ramis again. Directed again by Ivan Reitman. This stars Bill Murray as John, Harold Ramis as Russell. You've got John Candy in there as Ox, Warren Oates as Sergeant Hulka, John Larroquette as the bumbling Captain Stillman, and then Judge Reinhold makes an early appearance as Elmo. This movie is another, I guess you could say, buddy comedy. Um, Bill Murray and Harold Ramis team up. They're two guys who are just not really satisfied in their dead end jobs. Bill Murray loses his girlfriend, his job, his apartment, all kind of in one fell swoop at the beginning, and they decide to join the army for the fun of it, as they as they say in the movie. And I think to me that really the best scenes in this movie are during their basic training. Bill Murray's interactions with Sergeant Hulka, the the all time, at least in my household, the all time iconic quote, "Lighten up, Francis." We say that to each other all the time. And then when they're learning how to kind of march, and the do wah diddy diddy dum diddy do, and that's a fact, Jack, razzle dazzle. It's just a lot of fun, and then they go on. And there's other iconic scenes. I think of the bar scene and the mud wrestling with John Candy, and "You're a Lean Mean Fighting Machine," and the introduction of the EM50 urban assault vehicle that they use to save the day. They end up as heroes. And but for me, like I said, that the most iconic stuff comes in the earlier part of the movie. And to me, this is going in the gnarly category. It's not quite up there with some of the other ones, but again, I would say it's maybe a little underrated. But I can't put it up there with some of the other heavy hitters, but still in my top 10, one of my all time favorites. All right. So we're getting near the end here, last three, and they're going to be pretty heavy John Candy features here. And, rest in peace, John Candy. Now, we've seen him at other points so far. But to me, John Candy, obviously hilarious, but a really unique talent in that he really brought the ability to not only be funny, but also just he had a real heartwarming nature to him as well. All the characters that he played, especially in these three movies I'm going to talk about, um, he had a lot of he put a lot of heart and a lot of soul into the roles, and he almost felt like your dad when you were watching some of these, and or your uncle in the case of Uncle Buck. But he just seemed like a good guy. Obviously, I didn't know him, but he brought something, like I said, just a warmth. That's the word I'm really looking for to the screen that some of these other guys really didn't. Even Clark, even Clark Griswold, the Clark Griswold character, I can't say really had the loving and the loving quality that John Candy brought to some of his characters, and I think he's unique for that, and he's special for that. Um, but anyway, let's get started with the first movie on my list here of John Candy greats, and that is The Great Outdoors. Now, this one, this movie isn't probably wasn't as big of a hit as the others, but it's one that I grew up on. As far back as I can remember, this is one of my dad's favorite movies. I've watched this movie, and I think of the opening scene with the Yakety Yak song. And but anyway, this movie came out in 1988, written by John Hughes, directed by Howard Dutch. It stars Dan Aykroyd as Roman Craig. You've got John Candy as Chet Ripley, Stephanie Faracy as his wife Connie, and then Annette Bening as, and I believe this was her first role as Kate Craig, who's Roman's wife. And similar to National Lampoon's Vacation, Chet Ripley just wants to take his family on a vacation, and I believe they're in the somewhere in the Canadian wilderness, not Canadian wilderness, but they're out in the woods in Canada somewhere. They rent a cabin, and Roman, his brother-in-law, and his family show up uninvited. And throughout the whole course of the movie, it's kind of Chet and Roman, you know, taking very different approaches to a family vacation. Chet wants to give his kids the experiences that he had as a kid, and Roman is all about the flash and the money and the impress. And they kind of butt heads throughout the course of the whole movie. And to me, the most iconic scene is the water skiing scene with "Suck My Wake," and Chet is, he's giving his son directions, and he gives, Roman's, getting impatient with this speedboat, and he kind of gives Roman, waving him off and gives him like a thumbs up, and Roman ends up taking Chet and dragging him through the cattails. And I'm not, again, I don't want to repeat the language, but that scene is just all time hilarious. And talk about a name for a boat, suck my wake. Um, and you got the scene on they go horseback riding, and Chet ends up losing his quote unquote ball slicking nag, um, and having to walk back to the ranch. You got the go-kart scene where Chet's out with his kids go-karting, and Roman's on the driving range and hits Chet in the face with the golf ball. The bear dump with the zag nuts, and the bears end up climbing all over his car. Um, and then the bald-headed, bald-butted bear that makes an appearance at the end of the movie. This is just a really special movie to me. It's really funny. If you haven't seen it, I and how can I forget the bat scene? The 2 pound bat, the 2 pounder. Wow, wow, is all I can say. But again, yeah, this is just a really special movie to me. It's a righteous movie. I can't quite get it up there with the Totally Rads, but I love this movie. It's a lot of fun. All right, and next up we have Uncle Buck. Uncle Buck came out in 1989, written and directed by John Hughes. It stars John Candy as Buck, the main character. You've got uh, Macaulay Culkin. Now, I don't know exactly the timeline of this and Home Alone, but they both, I believe, came out in '89. So this was Macaulay Culkin on the verge of stardom, if not already kind of there, but getting there. You had Jean Louisa Kelly as Tia, his sister, and Amy Madigan as Shanice. So in this one, it's kind of the parents are out of options for they've got to have an emergency, have to leave town, out of options for who they're going to have watch the kids. So they call Uncle Buck, who is the black sheep of the family, and he comes in and really kind of shakes things up in a good way. Now he's a bit of I don't want to call him a loser, but he just hasn't really found his way in life. He's got a girlfriend, but it's she doesn't necessarily trust him. It's kind of off and on. His job situation is all over the place, and um, he's just not he's not the picture of stability. And just scenes that stand out in my mind. Obviously, the scene with Miles, played by Macaulay Culkin, where he's interrogating him, asking him every inch of detail about his life, and just that back and forth between the two. I think you can tell in that scene that Macaulay Culkin was going to be something. He was going to be a star. I think of I think of him with the giant pancake. Um, when the clown shows up and he punches the clown in the face, and then the principal with the mole, Buck Melanoma, and the hatchet scene with Bug, the boyfriend there, and John Candy just talking about how he doesn't use it to kill, but to maim, and shave off a bit of kneecap. And my dad has famously quoted that, and threatened that he's going to do that. And in the car, obviously the car that backfires all the time. This movie is a lot of fun. It's gnarly. Um, and it's a good family comedy too. Again, that John Candy brings a lot of heart to this one. And there are some really heartwarming scenes, and the way he connects with the family and the kids, and forms a special relationship with them is it's really well done. All right, and this takes us to the last movie on the list, and that is Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. This came out in 1987, also written and directed by John Hughes. You got to give John Hughes credit here. John Hughes, Harold Ramis, those guys are coming through big on this list. And it stars Steve Martin as Neil Page, John Candy as Del Griffith of the American Light and Fixture, director of sales in the shower curtain ring division. You've got Layla Robbins as Steve Martin's wife, Susan. Michael McKean plays the state trooper, and you see Kevin Bacon in this one as a taxi driver. And again, with the holidays coming up and Thanksgiving coming up this coming Thursday, this movie centers around Thanksgiving. And Steve Martin, who's in advertising, he's obviously a businessman who's on the road a lot, away from his family, and he just wants to get home. And for me, this movie, you can really identify with the two characters. You got Steve Martin, who's just caught up in the busyness of everyday life and working and that grind, and just kind of that end is in sight. You just want to get to. I've said it a few times. I'm looking forward to the break this week. You just want that little break, that time you can enjoy with your family to decompress and wind down and just enjoy the holiday. And everything goes wrong. And instead of spending time with his wife, he's spending time with Dell and John Candy, who is just seemingly content to wander his way through life. He doesn't really have any aim, doesn't really have any direction. Just kind of goes with the flow and makes the best of any situation. And in that way, he's a lot of fun, but also an obstacle for Martin's character in this. And as the story goes on, you see Neil start to slowly unravel bit by bit, and Steve Martin, just great acting by him. And some of the iconic scenes when they have to share the bed, and they wake up and they're spooning, and Neil asks Dell, where's your other hand, and between two pillows, and those aren't pillows, and there's that actually reminds me of a real life experience I had camping with my buddies Christian and Mike Strain. I'm not going to tell that story, but if you guys catch this, you guys, that was really funny. And then obviously the whole going the wrong way scene when John Candy, driving along again, happy as can be, just going with the flow, yammering on a mile a minute, ends up, barely splitting the two tractor trailer trucks, and just seeing how that car gets, completely destroyed by the end of the movie, and when Neil is pretty much lost it, and the tops off the car, and the two of them are all dirty, and John Candy's asking him, "Oh, you ever been to Hawaii?" And that it's just um, a scene on the bus with the Flintstones, and you get Dell gets everybody on the bus singing the Flintstone song. So many iconic scenes in this movie. It's a lot of fun. And this movie also takes a bit of a serious turn at the end, and you see Steve Carell or not Steve Carell, Steve Martin. I hope I haven't said Steve Carell a bunch of times. Also funny, but you haven't seen Steve. You see Steve Martin unravel, but then and he really kind of gives it to Dell at a certain point, and just you know snaps and cuts him off, and wants nothing to do with him. And then you come to find that Dell doesn't have a home, and so it takes a more serious turn. And to me, this is one of the great buddy comedies of all time, and it definitely puts a unique spin on it. It's not two guys like Jake and Elwood Blues who have known each other. um, it's not the Ghostbusters again, doctors who are, these are two guys from completely different walks of life who have to come together and make it work, and do and don't to a certain extent. But, that's kind of life, and it's symbolic of kind of the people you meet along the way. Um, and to me, this movie is righteous. I plan on watching it this week. It's a lot of fun, and Steve Martin, I think probably could have a few more spots on this list for films he did. If I had, again, I probably should have put him in the honorable mentions, but Steve Martin, definitely a legend, um, and an essential part of this group. Um, all right. So that is my list. Like I said, I don't think there's ever going to be another decade like that for movies. You can see behind me, you've got Back to the Future behind me. And there's so many other movies from the 80s that I could talk about, and maybe I will another time. And if I missed anything, um, if I left any comedies out, that you think are essential, please let me know in the comments. Thank you as always for tuning in. Thank you for helping me make this YouTube channel a success. I can't believe how well it's been doing, and I hope to keep it going this week. I hope to get back to some sports things, The Patriots have certainly been dropping some stink bombs on us lately, so I do want to spend some time, hopefully with a buddy of mine, talking about that. But until then, God bless.